Hey there, it's Ryan, and welcome to today's warm Seascape lesson. We'll work on clouds, waves. It'll be a lot of fun. And before we begin, I will run you through our materials. I will be personally working with pigments from Winsor & Newton. With that, I will also be working with my brush set. It is a 5-piece brush set, and I use it for all the lessons here on the channel. With that, I will be working on an 8x10 inch canvas. I have a small dish of water and some paper towel to wipe off all of my excess water and pigment. Now, if you're looking at the image and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not great at drawing, don't worry, I also have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you will get the perspective, the sizing, the details, all of that just right. And up there you can also get things like the reference photos, bonus lessons, we do art critiques, and you can also get my ebooks, which include acrylics for beginners. So if you're interested, check it out, but those are the materials and we are about to get started. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This will just help extend the wet life of our paint. With that, I'll head to the palette and grab a little bit of Ultramarine blue, good amount of titanium white, and a hint of Mars black. This will render a nice blue for the top of our sky, and we won't have too much blue in this painting, but it'll be some nice diversity. With that, we'll start applying in the open area to the top right, and we'll just slowly work this way down. I'm going to slightly overlap a lot of the drawings that I did so that I can overlap the clouds on top of this and we have some room to do so. I'm also only going to bring this down to about a third of the sky. And from here, we switch on over to something a little bit more pink. So I'll grab some of my cadmium red, about an equal mixture here of my much more pink pigment, which is called Opera Rose. And we'll also add some titanium white to that, as well as some Mars black. We're really looking for a brighter to mid-value pink, and we want a good amount of it. So you can see that I'm taking up quite a good space on my palette. We'll start applying that under our blue, and I don't want them to touch just yet, because as soon as they do, we will dilute both pigments, where I want to be able to work with the pink as is and bring it down as is for a little bit first. So, as you can see, we're just working around our clouds using this brush because it does have those nice sharp edges to cut around details, but at the same time quite large, so I can move a lot of paint. Great for blends. And here we are blending. I'm working in a bit of an X-shaped pattern with my brush. This is going to bring the pinks up and the blues back down. So we're working back and forth. And then as we start to get lower, I'm just going to clean off my brush quickly. And I'll grab some of my Naples yellow, as well as some extra titanium white. We'll mix these two together to make a great pigment for the bottom of our sky. And much like the last layer, I'm not going to have it touch the pink just yet. I want to work my way throughout all of the bottom sections through here. This will be a bit of an amalgamation of the two because it'll be showing through clouds, so it won't be as bright or noticeable, but we'll still have some of that. And then we will go for our blend. Now my pink has started to dry a little bit at the top. That's okay. Because our brush is damp, it'll re-interject some life back into it. We can always just do more layers. Now with acrylics, you'll often want to go back and do a second layer just to make sure that it's nice and thick. And I do recommend doing so once it's dry. It also gives you an opportunity to change your colors just a little bit should you want to. Almost makes that first layer be a bit like a practice round. And then you can go in and really refine your painting in the second, third, fourth layer, however many you really want to do. And again, I'm doing an equal mixture of both reds for our more pink pigment. Still using a hint of Mars Black. And you'll very quickly see that this looks a lot better, a lot more professional. We won't have the canvas showing through. Our blends will be softer as we're not as rusty. And then yet again we'll move into the yellow pigments. You can also see that this layer goes on a lot faster, simply by virtue of the fact that we've done it before. We know what we're doing. So we are set up for success. The fact that we're doing it faster also allows us to blend more easily, which with acrylics is always nice, right? Now we do have the light coming from below the horizon, and we're going to want to create various highlights for the bottoms of the clouds, light that runs across that surface, and create something quite pretty. So for this, I'm using predominantly our Naples yellow and titanium white, very small hints of both of our reds. And for the actual application, I want something much more pristine, so I'm going to be switching to my liner brush. As you can see, it has a very small tip. We'll make sure that's nice and damp, just to aid us with our blending, condense the bristles. And with this, I'm going to imagine again that there are a lot of clouds down here, and we're just going to highlight the bottoms of them. So that means creating these very inconsistent lines. Lots of little bumps. Sometimes they connect up and down. Just like so. You can barely see it. It's very subtle, at least in the first application. Just like so. And for the second, I'll get you a bit closer. Now we'll double down on some of these. And because our brush was so watery, everything just wasn't opaque, right? This will give us an opportunity to make the more prominent areas opaque. And that'll build some depth, because when we have areas that are a bit more thick and some that are thin, it really looks like that light is working its way on surfaces. The more opaque it is, the more light there is. And then that light just kind of works its way off as we move in towards the backs of clouds and areas that just can't really receive it to that same level. So we're just going in, adding these highlights. Nice and easy. Admittedly, the bottom area here probably could have used a third layer, but with these additions, I think it'll look just great. You can see that we're really going back, tripling, quadrupling down on our favorites. Here you can see how the lines connect. Trying to be quite loose so that I don't accidentally create too many patterns. There we go. Now we'll pull back just so we can make sure that we're seeing enough of the canvas, because it's really easy to hyper focus on the details and kind of get lost in how much we're actually applying, where we're applying it, if it balances throughout the piece as a whole. So It's important to keep some distance. And here I'm just starting to make the clouds have more and more space between them as we move upwards. That's because perspective isn't condensing them, so we'll just see a bit more of them. It's not that they're actually larger closer to us, it's just that perspective will allow us to see a bit more. And with these, much like the others, I do go back, I add additional layers, and we build them up. There we go. Now we'll mix up the brightest variant of that same pigment, just doubling, tripling down on the titanium white. Going to add that into the very bottom. That way we have this gorgeous glow. Won't look like a glow just yet, but as we add more to the painting, it'll make more sense visually. So we'll just add this to the bottom. Again, keep those clouds nice and tight right through here. And then it dissipates, gets wider as we move upwards. Not too tricky. Now, I want to start making the sky a little bit less flat, so we're going to create a cloud right over here. It's going to be fairly soft. We'll use our this is an Opera Rose and our Cad Red in about equal mixture. Grab a hint of our Titanium White, hint of our Mars Black, and the goal here is to render something not too bright, not too dark. We want a real mid-pink. And I'm going to apply this with the larger flat-headed brush. That way I can get these big sweeping motions. And just looking at the reference photo, expanding it on my phone. We'll bring that up through there. We'll have it work its way back down. And it can even overlap portions of this cloud. They can kind of work into each other. Now we need to make the bottom of it quite a bit brighter. So additional titanium white. And we'll go with some of our cadmiums and our rose. And we do apply this to the bottom of the larger strokes. So you can still see the strokes, you can see the top areas. It's pretty intuitive when we can connect this down into our pass markings. We'll do soft blends up towards the tops of our last ones. Just like so. Using very little pressure so that I get these really smooth applications. And to be honest, I applied a lot of pigment here. I think I want a little bit less. So what we're going to do is we're going to re-interject some sky, taking our titanium white, our Mars Black, our Ultramarine blue. This is really good that this happened, because I like to show you how you can walk different subjects back. You don't have to worry about overdoing it or messing up, because with acrylics it's just so easy to re-interject other colors, layers, and pigments. It's just such a forgiving medium. So here I'm remixing that blue that we used in the sky, and I'm using it to break up portions of these clouds. This is all still very wet, so I can blend into it and really change things. I'm using a filbert brush to do so. Has those nice rounded edges, so it's great for soft blends on clouds. You don't have to do this layer. This layer is really just if you feel you added a little bit too much of that pink, or you feel like that cloud's just quite large. I just want this to be a supplementary cloud. It doesn't need to take all of the attention. It's not our primary subject. So with that in mind, I'm just trying to keep it a bit softer. There we go. This brush is still damp. The pigment on the canvas is starting to dry a little bit, but it's not really a big deal because we can get some wet and dry blends. This is creating a really nice layered effect. I'm working my brush in circular motions to get those soft blends. There we go. Let's take a couple steps back and just make sure we're on the right track. Stepping back, love the top of it. It's time to transition this into this. So here we grab our titanium white, a little bit of our Naples yellow. We're going to something very bright, hint of cad red, hint of our opera rose. It's still predominantly a mixture of yellow and titanium white. We just have the other two so that it creates a fair transition into everything else. And then from here, we'll create the bottoms of some of the more structured portions of these clouds. Create those lines, and then with a damp brush, I'll do a blend upwards. Working my brush in some circular strokes. And we're just trying to make these motions a bit larger, a bit more detailed up here. And then we take those colors and we blend up. That way it all feels like a singular, cohesive subject, but these clouds are these clouds. These just have more white and warm light on them towards the bottom. This is one of those steps that just brings everything together. And we go over our more important layers a number of times, as we know. This will add some great life into these clouds. We don't want to go too high with the highlight though, because it will dissipate the farther we get from that background, right? We're just doing a bit of finger blending towards the top. Never get too old for finger painting. Just be careful that your hands don't have any oils on them. Otherwise you can kind of take off previously applied pigments. Make the canvas unsuitable for more watery applications. So just make sure your hands are nice and clean before you do so. Now we'll start applying more soft clouds throughout the painting, and we're going to start with an equal mixture of both of our reds, Add a lot of titanium white, smallest hint of Mars black. We're going to start with something a little bit more on the darker side, at least relatively. And we can apply that initially right to the top left-hand corner because we do have a cloud here. Like so. Now we'll brighten it up by just interjecting more titanium white. We'll switch on over to the filbert brush because it has those nice rounded edges. And I'll create said edges by just doing wispy little marks back and forth, like so. I want them to blend into the sky fairly naturally, so there are a lot of soft touches. I'm really trying to avoid hard edges for the most part. And this will all look a lot better once we have a second layer up at the top there. Right now it's quite thin, we can really see the canvas showing through. So let's grab some extra Cad red, titanium white, pink. Let's go in with this. The more titanium white we add, the more thick our pigments will be. Oh, and this would be beautiful. Not too worried about the back half yet. Right now what really matters is the edging and just making sure that we have nice little soft, wispy, semi-opaque markings. And these do extend downwards, even through here a little bit. We'll have a big cloud right there, there, and there. You're gonna have little clouds which break off, which is always a nice addition. Easy extra details. Makes the clouds look less solid and hard. Here's another one. And while the front half of this cloud is still wet, we'll make a version that has a bit more Mars black and even a hint of ultramarine blue. The ultramarine blue and the Cad red make a bit of a purple, which a really nice, almost bonus pigment. Apply that towards the top. Start that blend down. Again, I'm not really looking for hard brush strokes, I'm looking for soft blends and wispy traits, even in the more shadowy portions of our cloud. And these will feel a lot more natural once we get more of them in here. So this will be a fairly prominent pigment in the painting. I want to make the real pinks pop so nicely. So with that, we are going to head over onto the right hand side because we do have more of those bright background soft clouds, which can work into the background, as you can see. Kind of act as a transitionary piece. And then we'll grab that darker pigment, work that behind, and just connect them. Now from here, we have the background essentially set. So we're going to start working on the more prominent clouds, and we're going to do so initially by rendering a fairly bright pink, a lot of our reds, our titanium white. You can see that it's quite a match actually for some of the highlights that we've used previously. And then we're going to create a second color just off to the side. And this is going to be much darker. It's also going to have a hint of purple. So I'm going to move away from the titanium white. We're going to double down on our reds, our Mars black. We want this to essentially be the darkest pigment that we have so far. We don't want it to be actually dark. We just want it to be dark relative to everything else we have. You can see we're doing little tests here and there. I think we're quite close. Just interject slightly more Mars black. And using these two pigments, we'll start crafting our clouds. Now, I'm going to make the edges of our clouds, of course, a bit brighter, because that light from the background is going to essentially work its way around these clouds. And we're starting in the middle. It's the most prominent. You don't have to. You can start on the sides if you want to be a little bit safer, but we have undiluted pigment. We've warmed up in the background. I think we're ready. So I'm just starting to apply this. And then once I have the edges built, I'm going to grab the darker pigment and I'm going to apply that in the center. We'll do a soft blend into the edges. So using the corner of the filbert brush, that nice round edge, we just softly work it in there. It's worth noting that there's going to be less light working around the right-hand side of this cloud, so I'm going to make that brighter edge smaller than what it is on the left-hand side. If we have brush strokes of the filbert in here, that's not a bad thing because it'll just look like good cloud texture and volume. If your pink starts to dry, we can always go back and add more. Create those wet into wet blends very simply, like so. And just being able to go back and forth between the two pigments is so efficient. There we are. Now it's worth noting this actually is a fairly large surface area, so if you'd like, you can go in with the larger flat-headed brush to get the initial applications on. I'm doing so just to deliver a bit of a larger, thick layer. You can see the difference between that pigment and this pigment, and that difference is really just the thickness of the pigment. So quite easy to make it look a lot better. We can also grab our pink with that same brush, though the blend isn't going to happen in the same way as our filbert. So we're switching back to the filbert with some of our highlight. And again, if you're curious, all of these brushes you can find in the video description. They are from my brush set, and it is the brush set I use for all of the acrylic lessons here on the channel. So once you have it, you don't need to go out and buy new brushes. We're also very efficient. We only ever work with the same 5 brushes on these, so it doesn't get too complicated, and that's really the goal, right? Try to make this whole process as accessible as possible, so we can all have fun rendering our ideas, these settings. Just adding a little bit more of that bright hue up into the top so I can blend the darker hue back into it. Now we do have more of these clouds, one of which is over here. I'm actually just starting with the darker hue on the edge. We already have that lighter pigment, so we're just transitioning that darker pigment out. And I'm doing so intentionally because we have a lot of brightness through here, and this will really pop, it'll stand out, it'll look great. And we can justify it just by the fact that if the cloud itself is very dense, then it won't have light working through it, and it will just be darker. And this will all connect towards the bottom here. Instead, let's grab a little bit of that pink. We don't have to do a dramatic blend, but through some areas I think it'll be advantageous. We'll build that volume. We only really have volume through gradient, right? So when we void gradient for that more stark silhouetted effect, we have great contrast, but we do miss out on a little something. So it's all about finding that balance. Stepping back, I think it's quite evident we need to make this edge significantly more interesting. So we're going to go in with our pinks. We'll create some wispy motions for that edge. We'll grab our darker, more purple hue, and we'll make that a bit more unique as well. Trying to keep my hand out of the way, but sometimes I do need to make a stroke where it moves in front. I do apologize for that. And then we'll just scrape on some of the darker pigment over here. Connect the two at the bottom. Now that warm light really shines through, right? You need the contrast of the highlight with the darker pigments to really make it something special. Now, once this dries, we are going to need to go over it again. We'll do this a couple of times. We'll just slowly build up these layers. All of them do need that second, third, fourth layer. But while we wait for that to dry, so we can refine it, we are going to move over into the right-hand side. You can see that I'm moving much more quickly because we just have had time to warm up. And again, if you lost the clouds, your placement, all of that, you can always go back to the start of the video, look at the drawing, or if you're up over on Patreon, you can just download the traceable and copy the image directly. With that, I'm fairly happy with this so far. Now let's build some depth. Switch back over to the filbert. Work our way around the edges. Get off the majority of the pigment before we really move in and start creating those gradients, like so. Having both still wet makes this a lot easier. But if it does dry, it's not impossible. And you can always go back and add one of the other colors, so it's a wet under wet. Starting to get quite fun. It's always fun, but when you can bring pieces together like this, it has something extra, right? Just feel like you're constantly being rewarded for your decisions and your applications, and all of the layering that initially looked a little bit awkward, it starts to all feel great. And you can see that we're always going back and we're always adding more layers. Just trying to build up that depth. Now, yet again, we'll take that step back. Just make sure that things are coming together in the way that we want them to. I'm adding some extra highlight towards the bottom area because we'll just get a bit more light through there. I think that's just pragmatic. Brighten it up. It's all about creating these small little layers, right? These small transitions that look subtle to the point where as you're applying them, you're asking yourself, am I really doing much? But as the painting comes together, as areas conclude, you realize just how impactful those micro applications and decisions were. By the way, little personal update. Finally, have the Invisalign out, which I assumed would make talking much easier, right? We went through a period there where sometimes words just didn't come out right. However, I think just because of the change, it almost got worse. And I can tell that it's slowly getting better and that I'm readjusting, but it's funny. As somebody who talks on the internet for a living to a point, not being able to talk as well as one can normally is a feat. But that's okay. Everybody's been so good about it, and I appreciate that. But I can tell that going through a learning period here yet again. From here, we're going to dip below these darker clouds, and what that entails is essentially creating a slightly brighter variant of what we had here, because light's going to move through it to a greater degree, not fully, but to a greater degree. We'll grab just extra titanium white for the mixture, for the most part. We'll start working that underneath, and I'm occasionally going to come up and work interesting shapes into our pre-existing clouds, like so. And then once I have a nice edge cut in, I can start working my way down. I think this mixture will actually be a bit better with additional upper rows. And we can even work this up into some of the breaks in the clouds. Just like so. We do need this to be fairly thick, but our first layers will unavoidably be rather thin. So I'll tell you what, we'll just cut along the edge of our horizon line, and we'll just fill in that remainder of white space in what will be the sky. That said, there's still quite a bit of detail to be done, even through this bottom section. It all starts with a base layer. Now, I know we just finished up a lot up here. That started to look great, and now yet again we're in a transitionary period. That really is acrylics, and that's okay. We'll make this look great just like we did the previous applications. We do need to go in with something thick. We do want to make sure that for the most part our previous base layer has dried. Don't want something too saturated. Oh, that's much better. Now you can see this little area of Mars black. That was just because I didn't mix my pigment as well as I could have. So that's a friendly reminder right there to do good mixes before we start jumping into the canvas. That said, it's not a problem. We can just blend it out, some X-shaped applications, and it's looking a lot better. I'm also going to take this opportunity to remix a bit of the darker variant that we had in this cloud. I think that should be close. It's a bit more color. It's a bit more saturation. We'll go back and forth with the reds and the blues. A little bit of titanium white, which will desaturate it, but we will find this. Won't always be the first mix, and this is just a friendly reminder that we don't always go with the first mix. We keep blending until we find what we really want. Much better. And now we can take this cloud, do a soft blend up into the top, and we can work this down into that bottom portion. We can do that with this as well. Just extending our clouds, making them a bit more unique towards the bottom here. And we do the real blends, of course, with the filbert. And I'll bounce between colors so that we get those nice transitions. Like so. Just add some extra depth. Little painting ASMR in the background here for you. Okay, so we have a couple layers on there. It's nice and thick now. And I think from here we can actually go back to more of the pigment that we used in this cloud. So not too dark, not too bright. Definitely more desaturated. Do a little test. Go a little brighter. And with this pigment, perfect. We want to move our clouds downwards, right? But we also want to imply that there are additional clouds, and rather that this is a cloud. And within it there are additional clouds which are kind of hanging, and we have the darker bottoms to them. So I'm going to start just dropping in some extra lines. These admittedly aren't in the reference photo. This is more of an artistic liberty. I think that could really build the painting in a nice way. So I'm still having these come down, but in addition we have these little breakup spots. So I spent quite some time refining this section, and I think I'm very happy with it at this point. It's not too saturated, it's not too bright, but it is brighter than what we have there. And we're going to take a break from the sky to head down, start in our water. We're going to begin in the background, and then we'll progressively work forward in stages, just to try to make it as digestible as possible. And in the back here, we're going to start with our base layer. I'll be doing so with the larger flat-headed brush, and we want to mix a pigment very much akin to what we have here, the darker, desaturated, reddish purple. Pink. I'll grab some cadmium red, ultramarine blue, titanium white, about an equal mixture of everything so far, and Mars black. We'll go a little bit darker. Not using an equal mixture of Mars black, I'm probably using about a fifth of that in relation to everything else, just because it's such a strong pigment. We'll do a test to see and make sure that we have the right pigment. I think it could be a little bit darker, but when we interject that additional Mars black, we desaturate it further, and because I'm desaturating it further, I want a bit of extra color with some cad red, ultramarine blue. And I think this should be great. Doesn't have to be perfect. So close. I'll just go a bit brighter. That is lovely. Okay, so from here, going to work my edge first, and I'm going to do so by creating a litany of horizontal lines. I'm not creating one elongated line, because often I find when I do so I create an arch, and portions of the marking are raised. We don't want that. We want it to be as flat as we can make it. We can also put painter's tape on the canvas and paint directly over it to ensure that it is just right, but I think we got to a great place without it. So now I'm just slowly working my way down, doing so slowly so that I can be careful, like so. Grab some extra pigment, and I'll work, this time roughly, around the top of the first wave, at least the first noticeable wave which is coming in. And then with some extra pressure on the brush, I'll just fill this in. When we apply that extra pressure, our bristles expand, we get a larger application. It's just nice and easy. So here we are, a little bit closer. The pigment has had time to dry, so I'm going over it the second time. And as you can see, we can no longer view the canvas through the layer. Makes a big difference. It's also less saturated, because when the pigment isn't thinned, it isn't as saturated. There we go. Now, we can have some fun. Make this slightly darker. Not by much, but a little bit. And we'll apply this right under the larger clouds, which will cast a shadow. So we'll just get a bit more. It's a soft blend to both sides. Apologies if my hands are in the way. Same thing on this side. And there's a bit right through here. So it's very subtle, but now we have these slight shadows which we can enhance with more detailed applications. Now from here, we'll mix up something that's quite a bit brighter. So we'll start with titanium white, a little bit of Naples yellow. That's actually about an even mixture. some of our pink, hint of Cad red, hint of Mars black. And the goal here is to render something somewhat akin to what we had on the sides of our clouds, be it potentially minorly darker. We'll switch over to our liner brush, make sure it is nice and damp so we can get a fine, sharp movement. I'm going to look for the openings between the clouds, and I'm going to start crafting horizontal lines, make them quite small, not only in width but also length, making them very tight together so there isn't much negative space, isn't much of that darkness between. However, there is still some, and we need that for contrast's sake. There we go. From just a little bit farther away, I think it already looks a lot better, but we are far from done. We'll apply some over here. Going to start this at about the middle point in here because this is a bit higher. There we go. Now as this dries, I'll head back. I'll double down on some of my favorite markings as the second application will add opacity, make it more dramatic. Just as we want it to be. There's also quite a lot over here to the point where it's going to reach the bottom in a dramatic fashion. And as I continue, as you can see, we are able to make these markings more quickly. My brush is very watery right now, so I'm getting these semi-transparent markings, but I actually like that a lot. Allows me to build more depth just by variance. There we are. And now we'll head back here. It's had some time to dry, so we can do those touch-ups. And I actually want to extend these to the point where they connect a bit. We started small in the general area and then we expand as we go. I'm also going to take this pigment once it's very watery and I don't have a lot left on my brush, and I can expand that out into all of the negative space. So it's much more subtle, but it still creates that texture. Which is so beneficial for the visual of the water. Now from here, we'll mix a version of this that's a little bit darker, perhaps a bit more blue, but we're still using all of the pre-existing pigments to create it. We also want it to be fairly desaturated, and really it can be a mix between these two. So we might as well just mix it in between. Make sure we're working with those correct pigments. And I love this. So I'm going to actually take the larger flat-headed brush, and it's very damp, so the bristles are tight together. I'm able to render extremely small markings, and I'm just tapping these lines, often not with the entirety of the brush. I'm just using half or a third of it, but it's going to create more of what we were just doing with the liner brush. You can also do this with the highlights, should you want to. It's an easy way of delivering a lot of really straight markings. I'm applying these more so close to these as they act as nice little transitionary steps. We also want to make this as a whole a bit brighter. I'm going to do so with a glaze, but I need it to fully dry. So from here, I think we're going to move on to the next step while this does dry. You know what? Change of plans. I'm actually going to grab more of the darker pigment that we initially used. If anything, I'll make it a little bit brighter just because I know I want to make this as a whole brighter. And I'm going to apply this below that first wave because I want to be able to layer the wave on top of both this and this. So while this is in front, the wave will crash down in front of it. So I think depth-wise this actually makes the most sense. And as you can see, we can just speed through the process here. I'm going to make sure that we have a good amount of pigment. And I think this will actually be good for the darker areas even. So I'll switch to making a lighter color. Lots of our titanium white, pink, Naples yellow, cad red. This has slight room for brightening. There we go. It's very desaturated. We can bump that up. And you can see I'm mixing a lot of it. Because we do have quite a bit of surface area to cover. So this is something that will essentially should match what we have here, and it does. So that's great. You can go in and apply a bit more even. Just make sure that this area and this area are cohesive by hue. And now from there, we move into the slightly closer portion where I'm doing really what I was doing before, but I'm applying slightly more pressure and I'm making these larger markings. And then as I run out of pigment, I can move to the sides that'll be darker, as we have in the past. Grab more paint. You can see it very quickly comes together in this step. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot more we can do. We can really refine. We can make it much more detailed and intentional, but as far as first layers go, it's quite quick and easy. Once that starts to dry, we can go back, start adding more. We can be playful with it. They don't all have to be perfectly horizontal. When we get this close to us, we can start adding in some triangular pieces to make it look like there's rises and falls within the water. There we go. Now we'll take a step back. Doesn't look too bad. And we'll switch to our liner where we will refine. We'll pick the more notable, prominent applications that we enjoy. and small horizontal stroke by horizontal stroke, we will build up something full of motion with more intentional mark making. So, I think we'll also have the opportunity, the ability to build on it with some additional highlights as well. Can definitely get brighter, get more saturated, but we do need to start with our base layer. That's what we're doing right here. Sometimes my strokes get a little bit too big, and that's typically an indicator that I just need to get some extra water on my brush. Now let's head over here, but for that I will get you closer. Now while these markings are, I think actually I like them more than what I liked over here, I am going to change them to be smaller, less dramatic, and I'll do so by just creating smaller markings which break them up. And I'm doing so because I don't want these waves to be dramatic. Right now those waves look somewhat dramatic just because they are larger, they have more of that triangular feel, which again I think is good to start interjecting, but we need to be careful with how much we do so. So now I'm going back in, making these fine movements, and it already makes the water look less dramatic. It isn't moving in the same way that it was. And that's a good thing, because this water is quite close to us and it's not meant to be anything but calm. It's meant to be a calming scene. We need our water movements to reflect that. Starting to run out of paint, so I'm working my way towards the right hand side. Just applying those little markings in a less dramatic fashion. We can do so in here as well. You can already tell this essentially second attempt is a lot better than the first. And we can go back and we can really work on the first, and we will. This goes to show that if it doesn't go amazing the first time, that's okay. Sometimes we're a little bit rusty, sometimes we're learning, sometimes we just need to do a couple of layers, and that's what we're doing. A lot of layers. Now, stepping back, I like it, and I really just want to go brighter. So, titanium white, Naples yellow, both of these. Perfect. Won't be as bright as it is on the palette as it is on here, because of course we'll have the undercolors showing through, but let's give this a try. Let's just go in, start layering it on top of some of our previous highlights, and see what we can do in terms of building the visual volume. You can see that it's really not adding much in terms of saturation, but these little pops look like great subtle shimmers of light throughout our pre-existing highlights. And a lot of visual real estate over on this side we can definitely play with. Going to add it sparsely initially. Less is more approach. And then as we take steps back and we evaluate, we decide on going back in and how much we want to add in those scenarios, right? Do you think this is doing a lot? Some of these just look like little dots. It's also worth noting that I'm not going too far back right under this open area of canvas. I'm leaving that without these true highlights because I want there to be a bit of a shadow there from the actual wave. I'm going to do just hints of this out in the open darker areas, as there will be slight glimmers of light as well. We do still need to go over the top and glaze some extra light. Can't forget about that. Yet again, stepping back, I think that it's starting to come together. Yet again, I'm going to skip the area in which we will have waves, and I think I'm going to paint this bottom section with essentially the same pigment that we used for the backing here and here. I'm going to bring that up to where the wave will be. And we'll do the blending for that a little bit later, but I've been thinking about the glazing process. And what I really want to do is this area, and this area all at the same time. That way it fits together. So right now we're just making sure we have a solid application of majority of our water, minus a very important application, but do that in a bit. Let's do a second layer. And then get a bit closer. Now I'll mix up the pigment for this application using the same larger flat-headed brush. It's fairly clean, so I don't have a lot of diluted pigment on it. And we're going to remix this hue right here, which is about equal parts our pink and Naples yellow. That's just going to make it nice and warm, a little bit more of a peachy orange hue. There we go. And I might brighten it up just a hint. From there, we'll switch brushes to another smaller flat-headed brush. And I want this because it can hold a good amount of paint. We can create those horizontal sharp lines with ease, but I can also still get really sharp marking, or a really intentional marking like with the liner brush. It's a good in-between. So we'll grab some pigment with this, and the water here is going to be a bit different in that we're essentially washing up on the sand at this point, and the water is going to be moving in a bit more of a sporadic way. So I'm going to create a lot of zigzag effects, like so, leaving openings in between these applications. It's also worth noting that the base layer is still wet, and that's a good thing. We want that because it'll make our blend much easier. It's also worth noting that for the most part, I want the area that's closest to us to be sharp, and then it can get softer and blend upwards as you move towards the distance. So you can see how that's sharp, and then it moves out. And this is just going to give the impression that the water is moving forward. There's a bit of a build-up as it rushes in. I'm going to make sure my brush is still damp. Grab some extra water there. And we're combining areas. taking out a lot of the darker spots. And then I'll also start really brightening and combining even negative space. But before we do that, I want to finish off the majority of our progression forward, because that base layer is drying, and this will just be best achieved if we can get it all applied in the same way. It's not too hard right now, so we might as well just keep working our way forward. As it dries, you can see this gets more and more prominent. I have to work harder for the blend, but I'm still working my brush quite softly. Again, bringing pieces together. Trying to leave a bit of a darker lip underneath the wave for the inevitable shadows. And now that that's all applied, we can go back to combining sections, areas. Bringing the water together. Now, taking a step back, it definitely looks like the most rough portion, and that's okay. Still a lot to be done here. So I think we'll just start picking spots that can have a lot of highlight and eliminating that detail. I know it always hurts to remove detail, we feel like we work so hard for it, but often simplification is incredibly valuable in these settings. So it's still darker here, it's still darker here. We have this softer, brighter, more saturated piece below the highlights. So as we get closer, you can see that it's just starting to look like a wash with little areas that are highlighted, some that are a bit darker. It's meant to look vague, a little bit abstract, and that's good. What we're going to do is we're going to mix up the brightest, most saturated version of this. So a lot of titanium white, or pink, Naples yellow. And I do still want it to be predominantly a pink, so we'll double down on that. Switch over to the liner brush. We are back to very definitive small markings, and this is where we'll establish more form in here. But essentially, we're going to start creating highlights in those movements that we've already established. And these are going to wrap around and follow what is currently fairly vague. A lot of it's a tap and a drag effect. But this is going to make it feel much closer, much more tactile. You could reach out and dip your toes in, right? I think that's always the goal of painting water close to you, that sense that you could just extend part of yourself and feel all of that slowly rushing water. As I run out of pigment, I am working towards that central area where it's darker, as we have in the past. Barely noticeable, but we do want that continued pattern through there. more pigment. And you notice that I go back over these areas many a time, intentionally so. We do need to build it up. A lot of these are just taps. If we were working on a larger canvas, it would be more of a drag. We only have so much space to deliver all of this detail. And don't worry, we have another layer coming for the water as well. We have a couple. And cumulatively, I'll turn this into something special. I'm starting to be able to see it in my head, which is always exciting. We have a rough vision and estimate when we start our painting. We know our color palettes, we know our composition, but as it comes together, you get such a more clear version of that. And we're getting close. Let's get you a bit closer. Now, on to the other side. You can see a really bright spot right here, so I'm inclined to begin in that and just work my way out. Still following, for the most part, that which has been pre-assigned for the highlights. And even in these brighter areas, you can see there are going to be spots that I do want to keep somewhat darker. Now I do have a lot of water on my brush. Didn't mean to grab this much, but we can use that off to the sides and pre-establish those transitions and patterns in a more subtle way. It was more of an afterthought and an after application on the other side, but we can start with that if the brush is already quite wet. Then we'll grab some extra pigment. You can see such a dramatic difference. We're still using the same color, still using the same brush and application style, but we end up with something completely different. And again, starting to lose that pigment as a result. Starting to lose the saturation, the pop, the values. Not a bad thing, but something to keep in mind because we do want to be intentional with all of this. And like everything else, the more we do it, the better we get, the faster we can become. Not because we're trying to be fast, but just because it becomes somewhat of a second nature. That said, we still have a lot to do to this water. So now we'll step back and finally start applying our glaze, which will brighten a lot of the darker values down here. Now, typically our water and the reflections of that which is above are darker than that which they are reflecting. So we still want these hues and these values to be darker than what we have here, but we can definitely brighten them a little bit. I'm going to grab my 1-inch flat-headed brush, make sure it's quite damp, start to move some of this really bright pigment off to the side and just make it almost into a watercolor. We want it incredibly thin, and we can even interject a bit more of that pink. Then we'll apply it down towards the bottom, and I think I can already tell I want more water. And we'll slowly just work that up. Like so. You can see that it almost flattened it to a point. Makes it more subtle for sure. There isn't that heavy contrast, which does take away some level of depth, but an amount that I'm happy with. Here I'm just taking a little bit of it off with my finger. You have to be careful with finger painting because if you have oils on your hands, it can make it so that area doesn't receive paint in the future to the same extent, but I think that worked really well. Let's get back in nice and close. Now, before we really proceed, I do want to note that that glaze effect, that wash, Only recommend doing it once all of the other layers are fully dry. If they're not, you will rip that paint off. So do wait a good 10-15 minutes before doing so if you do want to do so. And with that, we are now going to mix a new pigment. It's going to be a bit more blue heavy than our past. We still want some red in it. And this is going to be the base layer for the waves. Now, I don't want it to be too saturated. As you can see, that in comparison with everything else is quite. So we'll add in some extra Mars Black and Titanium White. A little bit of red. A little bit of blue. And I think this will go great. Now, if it's not perfect, we can always do another layer. But we'll get this on as our base. You can see I'm still using the larger flathead. I'm trying to create areas that lift and then come back down. Not too tricky. There we go. I do like that a lot, though I think the issue with it is that it is still too saturated. So more Mars Black, more Titanium White, mix that up, start applying layer number 2, and I can already tell this is better. I don't know that it's desaturated enough, but it's definitely in that right direction. If we need to do a third or fourth layer, we can do that. This also makes the layers more opaque just by virtue of using additional Titanium White and Mars Black because they're more thick than the typical hues. Let's double down. I lost a little bit too much of the color in that mix there. Still want a hint of red. Remember that the color that I have on my palette isn't really the color that I'll have on the canvas because we do have color underneath, and it's not only an optical blend that's happening right now, it's a legitimate blend. The pigment is still wet. And you know what, while we let this dry, we might as well move towards this one right here. We're just doing base layers right now. And these waves are going to feel quite close, so I'm going to try to be sharp with a lot of my markings. Means keeping the brush damp. Making intentional line work. There we go. Okay. Very good, very good. Now we'll get the bottom. And we'll try to incorporate some of the shadow as well. So this has this larger piece that comes up, and that will create an effect towards the bottom. It doesn't have to be as opaque. We can have that more pinkish purple show through. But we do need this area to be opaque. Everything still is open canvas. Now I'm adding a little bit of Mars Black into that mixture. I'm putting it towards the bottom third of our wave, at least in the foreground here. I'm blending it up softly using very delicate strokes. And this is just giving us a little bit of a gradient, showing that the water closest to the actual body of water is darker because less light can pass through, and as you move up in the wave, more light can work its way in there, and that creates that brighter value and hue. So I just do that. I might do a hint of it, slightly brighter version, so I'm using more of the original mix to work that into this back one. But I want this back one to be much more subtle, so I won't do too much. Like that. Okay, I think it's time to start adding back in some details. I cleaned my brush and my water because I want something that's going to be not diluted by the previous pigments, and we're going to mix up a purple. So we'll use, again, our Cad Red and our Ultramarine Blue. This needs to be brighter than what we have right here. And it does need to be blue dominant in our mix. Also needs to be much more desaturated than it currently is, so I will be working in the extra Mars Black. Just like so. I think this would be a great pigment to work with. So, we'll put that down, we'll switch on over to our smaller liner brush, grab that pigment, and we'll start to create some highlights in our waves. I'm going to apply that to the top, and I can already tell, well, I really like the color on the palette. It could be a bit brighter on the canvas. So extra titanium white, just like so. Give that a go. Again to the very top. And it's not too dramatic. It's fairly subtle. We're essentially just outlining for this first part of the application. Like so. Grab more pigment. And when it's quite opaque, I think it's close to the right value. But when it's thin by the water, it's just a little bit too dark still. We have too much of the dark base showing through. So, it's time for our second edit. And I'll throw a hint of extra ultramarine blue, because every time we add the titanium white, while we brighten it, we do desaturate. We take that blue and that red out, and we do want that blue. So, yet again to the very top. And then we start to move it down and in. I'm going to do a lot of rounded strokes for the most part, at least initially here. And the idea is that the water is crashing down, and there are lots of little movements kind of fluttering amongst that. So these are for the most part moving down in this direction. And then as we get towards the bottom, which happens pretty quick, it's not a large area, we start to flatten it. We create a little bit of a crash, which is done through the tap. And then we can move it out almost into horizontal markings that mimic that of what we have right in front of the wave. And this wave will be quite different in that it's not going to be in that crashed position just yet. The water will be more raised. And that'll be fun because it means we get two different aesthetics for our prominent waves, right? They're not dramatic waves. We still want a relaxed scene as a whole, but it's very quickly coming together. I think I'm just going to finish off this left hand side, and then we'll get closer and we'll do the right hand together. Also working some of this into the pre-existing horizontal applications, just so we have good transition too. Okay, let's get you closer. So now we're going back to the top because again we have a brighter color than we were working with previously. I'm just going to get this done first, and then I'll move back towards the center. That way we're making sure that our applications are similar to that of what we were previously working with. We are leaving openings between a lot of these, And you can see that for the most part it is going down in that direction, but then I'll create sub waves and areas that come up, crash down, come up a little bit, crash down. Makes it a bit more dimensional. I like this a lot. Have some thick pigment here, not as much water on the brush, so I'm actually going to bring this back towards the center and re-establish the highlights there, because we do want the viewer's eye more so in the center than anywhere else, right? Also, like to take this time and opportunity to say a big thank you to everybody watching, being here, supporting the channel. Also, a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making lessons like these happen. This channel is predominantly community funded, and it's done so by the incredible people and the incredible support up there. So to all of you, big thank you. I know I say it in every lesson, and I know it probably gets a little repetitive. Hopefully not annoying, but I do think it is important to show that gratitude, because I do just very much appreciate the opportunity to make these, to teach these lessons, to practice some traditional art. And you make that happen. So thank you. I'll also note, for those of you who are new here, it's your first time, up over on Patreon is where you can get the traceable. So you get that initial drawing, makes it easy to transfer. Up there you can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic paint before you jump into it. There's ebooks full of traceables for the uninspired days. I have a bunch of bonus lessons, some of which are on big 24 by 36 inch canvas, broken up into multiple parts. They're big series, so if you like working on a larger piece, that's where you can find those videos. You can also get access to an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces, asks questions, helps each other out. It's really quite wonderful. And you can also get video critiques from me at the higher tiers. There's a lot going on up there. So if you're interested in the ebooks, the bonus lessons, the big lessons, any of that stuff, check it out. Links in the description. And again, it's just a great way to support the channel if you can. If you can't, it's all good. But yeah, big thank you to everybody who does. You can see I'm slowly just brightening these waves, predominantly going back to the tops. There we go. Okay, let's take a bit of a step back and let's start working on this one. Okay, now this next area is a fun one. We're going in with that same color, but the technique is different. We're going to get that light still hitting the back of our waves. So I do begin at the top there. However, this is coming downwards and it's not crashing yet. So we actually see the bottoms of a lot of the waves. So I'm going to create a great deal of these mostly vertical markings, but as you can see, they kind of stagger, almost looks like teeth to an extent. And some of them will extend up higher, some will actually roll forward and connect, but not all. And then at a certain point, they will go down to that base and create that crash. And this is more similar to what we had up there. But it's important that it looks cohesive, that this area works into this area. So our strokes need to be somewhat similar. And there can be points where, again, it crashes, but maybe there's an area where it's rising again, and we get that half fall. Hasn't completed yet. Let's get you a bit closer though. So at this point, we have those first applications, and it's admittedly looking a little two-dimensional, but with extra layers and highlights, we'll definitely get this to something quite special. Now I'm going to start combining some applications, creating these larger markings, and that's some of the foam. It's also some of a splash effect. It's a confluence of different brighter subjects essentially. And this is something that I like to incorporate on the larger, more noticeable portions. So I think it's great here. I don't think it would work to the same extent to the right hand side. We can do maybe a little bit of it, but it will be minimal. And what's really making this look better right now isn't necessarily the larger applications. I do recommend still making them fairly small, at least initially. It's the fact that we're building highlight, and that highlight is differentiating itself from the past layer, which is giving us some depth. I'm also tapping on water that is falling, creating more minute markings. We can do that even throughout these larger areas. There we go. Got lots of taps at the bottom. We'll connect these to this to a better degree in a little bit. But right now we're still just laying down that groundwork for the most part. Now as we move slightly over to the right hand side, we're going to do a larger splash. Sorry, left hand side. The camera has it inverted. Will at least the LCD screen won't be inverted for you. We'll do some taps up there. I'm really creating a different kind of wave. We're just catching it on the angle. All of our markings are dissipating as we move towards the bottom because we're getting less light through there. This will look great once we go in with some additional highlights. Have that solid crash at the bottom from it, partially happening already. Stepping back, I think it's quite evident just how much variance we have in the wave, which was good. That's something I wanted to work hard to achieve. And I think we'll have some splashing up here as well as it kind of comes down, deviating minorly from the reference photo, but still following it to a fair extent. Lots of little taps. And at this point, I think it could really benefit from some highlight. So let's just mix some extra titanium white into this, and I can even use the liner brush because I don't need a lot of pigment. We'll start at the tops, the more prominent areas. We know that this is a big area of splashing. We're going with a less is more approach. I'm definitely going to build more highlight on all of these, but we're starting with the bare minimum, just so that we can watch all of it evolve together and make sure that it does so in a cohesive way. We don't want to overdo one area and then be forced to overdo others to have it match or walk back an area in a dramatic way, right? But just like this, it's not a big change, but I think it's making a big difference. There's a real flow to it at this point. Then I'm doing this horizontal marking, similar to what we have down here. We're blending those together to a point. See, we're bringing it in. Now we'll go in with slightly brighter mixture. Starting in the middle. You can see how this one truly pops, and I'm not trying to do the entirety of an outline towards the top. I'm really just catching the areas that protrude and catch the most light. Trying to be selective, intentional. You have different waves kind of crashing over each other. It's creating this interesting visual effect. I slowly work this down in pragmatic ways, just looking for the most grand highlights to accentuate. I'm not doing too much on the left or right hand side because I don't want to accidentally draw the eye to a place where I don't want it. At least where I don't want it staying. And we're just jumping around. Now we'll do some extra highlights towards the bottom where it's crashing, because that will be quite bright, even if it doesn't have direct light on it. The foam and the subject itself will just garner that visual, and that's great because it'll transition really well into the brighter highlights that we have here and here. See how they actually work really well together? So yet again, we take our step back, and I love how this is a little bit brighter than that. It's a little bit sharper. We're going in the right direction. However, we still have places to go. Now switching to the smaller flat-headed brush, I'm going to grab more of that same essentially base pigment that I used for here, and with this we are going to start to create some foam which can work its way out from the water. And I'm doing this in a lot of horizontal strokes that bend and wind, similar to the initial application that we did through here, when we were just putting the base layer before all of the tapped on highlights. And these should get a little bit larger as we get closer to us. So I expand them, I make them more thick, because perspective will make them look so. And this is just a darker base layer. We are going to enhance it, and we'll do so pretty dramatically. But this is a pretty unintrusive way to begin. Just like that. Let's get you a bit closer. Okay, now we have a base. Let's go brighter. So I'm going to interject extra titanium white, and also throw in a hint of our ultramarine blue, because I do want this to be a bit more bluish purple heavy than red. And I think that'll probably be great. So, back to the smaller flat-headed brush. And I'm going to apply this predominantly to the top of my previous markings. And I'll do a bit of a soft blend down. That just looks like it has a minor shadow to it. Like the foam itself is raised to the point where it can create a shadow, right? And when the pigment is thick, you can see it really catches, stands out. We went in with the darker pigment so we could see what it would look like in these shapes in a more subtle way, and to build that more shadow heavy application. Now we have the opportunity to build. And as you notice, I'm sure, it matches the hue and the values of the waves really nicely. So it kind of brings it all together. Now we have a lot of these larger markings. It is important to create some smaller ones as well, just so it all fits, feels natural. So I think what we'll do is, yet again, we'll go brighter. Might interject, hint more blue, because every time we go brighter, every time we add that titanium white, we do take away the blue, take away the purple. Now I'm switching to the liner brush, and with this I'm going to go in, but I'm also going to do some taps. This is just going to add a little bit of texture to our foam, make it more so pattern-wise akin to what we have around it as well. And if you look at foam up close, you notice that it really isn't just a lot of smooth lines and surfaces. It's comprised of a lot of little bumps. And that's what we're trying to visually articulate with this, predominantly in the foreground. As we get farther away, as I move into the background as we are now, I'll probably start connecting them a bit more, because when it is farther away we just don't see that level of detail to the same extent. There we go. Now you can see one side with it, one side without. It's up to you on how much you want to add this type of application. Depending upon how bright it is, it can be pretty dramatic or it can be pretty subtle. It's up to you. There we go. Okay, and now we'll go with a bit of a brighter version, and again applying it predominantly to the tops, and this is where it'll really start to pop and come into its own as a subject, being somewhat careful, not overdoing it initially. But if we do, we can always just go in with the previous pigment. And that is my phone alarm. We're on day 3 of the painting. I just woke up and decided to jump back into it. But that's good. We have an early start on the day. Really love these applications. The values are starting to match that of the more highlighted pinks that we have. So it just feels a bit more natural. It belongs in this setting. Now I'll probably double down on some of the highlights, more so towards the center of the canvas, as that is where we want our attention for the most part. And I'm dropping in some of these extra highlights just to darker areas. So we have hints of smaller parts of foam that aren't directly connected. There we go. Let's also take some of this, a mixture of the two, I think. And we can just wind that into the background a little bit. We're not doing a lot. I'm just making sure that this is a subject that doesn't solely exist in the foreground. We still have these waves in the back. They are still going to create that aesthetic. And again, it's a lot of zigzags. Trying to interject a bit of a pitter patter with my brush to disconnect applications. Like so. And this hue is really bringing the waves into the water, right? Now it's connecting in a way that it couldn't before, because we just didn't share the colors this deeply. We didn't have the opportunity to. It's a lot of back and forth. Okay, and now we can add some really fun highlights. So I want to mix essentially the brightest version of this. It can be more saturated than before, but I do still want some titanium white. Likely won't use any Mars Black this time. And I do still want the warmth of the Naples yellow. Hint of the Cad Red, though we don't want too much Cad Red in this because the Cad Red is a darker hue inherently. You can see just like that how it brought things down in value, but I think this will be perfect. So switching back to the liner brush, grabbing this pigment, it's quite damp. We are going to interject our brightest highlights yet, simply in those lines of light that we can see. I think that this can add such a good pop and shimmer to the painting. On the note of shimmer, if you follow this channel, if you've watched a couple lessons, you probably know I like to give little keywords that you can use in the comment section. I kind of hide them throughout the video, but if you use it in the comments as a singular word or you incorporate it into a sentence, it essentially tells me and everybody else who got this far that you are part of, on average, the 13% who makes it to the very end of these longer videos. So it's kind of like a little subtle badge of honor. I like to think of it that way. Always fun to see who continuously gets it. And today the word will be shimmer. So you can leave that as an individual word. You can work it into a sentence. Talk about how you're excited to make your piece do so. Because I believe in you. If you've taken the time to sit through this, I think you're someone who's ready, willing, dedicated to take in that information and then go and use it to make something of your own, something special, something you can put on your wall and care about, maybe give to family, maybe sell, you know? I believe in you. I think this is turning out great. Also, as we do near the end, I will note again that if you're interested in the brushes that I used for this lesson, they are linked in the video description. It is from my brush line, and I use these lessons for all of the canvases this size here on the channel. So once you buy the set and you do another lesson just like this, you don't have to worry about going out and grabbing different brushes, or more so your brushes just being different and acting differently, not rendering the same markings, right? So it takes the guessing out of it on your part. And I've been working with this brush set for about 1.5 years now. And it's doing great. So, if you take care of your brushes, it should last long. I think, it's not in the reference photo, which you can also get up over on Patreon, but it's not in the reference photo. I think I'm going to add some highlight into the wave, perhaps just to the tops. Watch me do it first, see if you like it. I don't want to separate the waves or congeal them. Really like how they've been, but I do think this is something that has the potential to look great. Yeah, you know what? I do like that a lot. I think it really brought it together well. We can do that towards the back. Just bring it down a little bit. I know you're quite far away, but that's very much the point right now. We're working on subtleties that we don't want to hyper-fixate close to the canvas. We want to look at it as a whole and make sure that the painting finishes in a way where it all connects, right? It all just feels right together. It all builds that atmosphere, and that really is the most important part of your painting. It's building that atmosphere. It's creating something that fits together, that's believable. That's what we're doing. Love that. Okay, now let's just go a little bit brighter on the pigment that we used for the water. Let's add some highlights to the foam in the foreground. Really bring our attention towards the center of the painting. Doing this predominantly with taps, not really many drags at this point. Going to avoid right under the wave because I do still want there to be some shadow in that area. Need more water. Keep my markings nice and sharp. There we go. Lovely. Just checked in the viewfinder and I really like it. I like looking in the viewfinder to kind of assess where my painting's at, because it makes the painting much farther away visually than I can be, right? It makes it really small. And that's incredibly valuable when looking at the painting. You can do so quite simply if you're not painting with a camera, by putting a mirror behind it and then looking in the mirror, because it'll present the painting at a real distance. And then you can see what it'll be like more so on the wall than right in front of you on the easel, right? I think I'm only going to add those real highlights to that foreground area, like so, because I don't want to make this compete with that in the same way. I want a subtle progression of those contrasting values. Now, before we complete the painting, let's do one more mix. We're aiming for a fairly light pinkish purple, akin to what we have at the top there. And this had the Mars Black, the Titanium White, Cad Red, Ultramarine Blue, or Pink. We'll do a little test. Oh, and we found that quite easily. Love that. So I'm just going to splash this in along the edges in case it's slightly different. That way it feels cohesive. That also could have been the word of the video. And I'm just going to drag this down a little bit to move the cloud down a little bit, so it doesn't just have this definitive ending. And we can do another one here, work that highlight down and back, just soften it. This is just going to add some extra depth for very little time. And now you can see this extends out here. We can do some little taps for smaller clouds that are just kind of working their way in between. Double down on some of these highlights. I think this adds a lot to a painting. You can also use the filbert brush, but I like the detail that this little guy affords me. But with that, that is essentially our painting. So thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being part of the community in general. Big thank you to everybody who is up over on Patreon. And remember, up there you can get access to the traceables, ebooks, bonus lessons, art critiques, the exclusive Facebook group, the larger 24 by 36 inch paintings. There's a lot to have fun with, make you a stronger painter, and just enjoy the process. So if you're interested, check it out. And with that, I'll see you very soon. I want to try a new series where I have a painting sketchbook of sorts, something that I can upload an extra video each week with. I'm still trying to find what I want in terms of paper and medium, but I think I may have found something that I really like. And if not, I was just talking to another artist. She actually inspired this piece with her own work, and she offered a really good idea. If you like Seascapes, pigments like this, actually I'll link her Instagram in the description. You'll probably find a lot of inspiration there. It's really hard to stop painting. I know I have this problem at the end of every painting, but it's a great problem to have, you know? To love what you do, to really get invested and just care. So, there we have it. That's the painting. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. I will see you soon. And I really do hope that this helps motivate you to pick up the paintbrush, to make something that you really do care about, to inspire you, to relax, all that good stuff. I know that painting really does a lot for me. This is something that always fulfills me, always makes me feel like I really did something with my day. Makes me just also quite appreciative, I find, of settings and scenes like this, colors and shapes. And I think when you can appreciate the little things in life like that, when you can notice them and embrace them, I think that just makes quality of life in general so much better. So I hope you find that painting and creating art does that for you too, because it's pretty wonderful. And I think we could all use some good. So there we have it. For probably the 4th time. You have a great day. And above all, as always, stay creative.